Her Excellency Rosa Whitaker is a global trade and investment expert, policy strategist, and pioneer of U.S.-Africa economic engagement. She is the president and CEO of the Whitaker Group, TWG, a strategic advisory firm that has facilitated billions of dollars in sustainable investment across African markets. Through her leadership at TWG, Rosa has advised African governments and Fortune 500 companies on investment promotion, industrialization, and inclusive growth strategies. Rosa made history as the first ever assistant U.S. trade representative for Africa, appointed by President Bill Clinton and reappointed by President George W. Bush. In this role, she played a foundational role in crafting and implementing the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, a landmark trade legislation that opened the U.S. market to African exports and deepened economic ties between the United States and Sub-Saharan Africa. Rosa sits on several advisory boards and has been recognized among Foreign Policy magazine's top 100 global thinkers. She is a respected speaker on trade, governance, and the future of Africa's economies. Rosa Whitaker is a faculty member at the School of Politics, Policy, and Governance, where she teaches Understanding Global Trade, the future of WTO European and Chinese trade agreements with Africa.
When we are part of a history-making venture or new move, most people that I've met who made history said we had no idea we were part of this historical movement. We just had a burden to act, to do something. I am sharing what I've learned for nearly 4 decades about trade, about investment, about Africa, that we can collectively and individually be a part of the solution. Why is the most resource-rich continent still one of the poorest, if not the poorest, if you're talking about number of people that's living below proportionally, that's living below the poverty line? And my response is, how do you define poverty? I would say that Africa is not really poor, but it has been poorly positioned in the global trade landscape. We have traded in the world, but not with the world. And what is this position? This is a position of accounting for less than 3% of global trade. And what the data says, that if we can increase Africa's global trade by even 1%, that would translate into billions and billions of dollars in wealth, even if we could move. So this is not just a disparity issue. It is also a structural design flaw. It's a relic of colonialism, and it has to do with the balkanization of Africa. Africa is the most balkanized region of the world. I don't like to just position Africa as victims. And I very much see the African Continental Free Trade Area as Africa's solution to address these many barriers. The African Continental Free Trade Area that has been ratified by 55 African countries is the world's largest trading bloc. It basically is an exercise to remove tariffs, to remove non-tariff barriers, to harmonize the trading systems so that Africa can trade more freely with itself and with the world. It is a counter to the balkanization of colonialism. That means Africa would operate as a single region. So that's a great solution. And leadership is the problem. We have to go beyond the ratifications, the nice speeches, that kind of conference culture, and really the devil is in the details. And we should hold our leaders accountable. No matter what field you're in, you don't have to be a trade expert to understand the impact of this. We have no choice but to do it, and to do it well. In order for the African Continental Free Trade Area to work, which is the best antidote to addressing some of the historical barriers to trade, there has to be a a leadership shift, an ideological shift, and a mindset shift that goes beyond just the talking. So I hope the call of action here would be to address the African Continental Free Trade Area, address the details. Believe me, your minds are stronger than some of ours and some of our leaders. And so you have the capacity. I would love to see this become a capstone, looking at the details, being even volunteer advisors to telling your governments how to navigate this, even putting out opinion pieces, calling for African countries to respect their obligations to each other, for Africa to really ascend in global trade. There is no magic bullet. We talk about the potential, but potential means nothing without power. In today's world, we see it. And so how do we strengthen Africa's hand as a group? It is about a multifaceted transformation with shared responsibility among African governments, African countries, and external trading partners and institutions. And I hope that as a call of action, you will commit yourself. We will represent and we will be, as a continent, a demographic dividend. Numbers mean very little. What means a lot is productivity. Africa is actually the donor of the world. Let's not rest on our laurels because we have this demographic advantage, because that demographic advantage can be a drag and a pull on those who are productive. So the world trade, when we look at Africa's place in global trade, we can't separate it, that we have a Nigerian and African leading the World Trade Organization. If the World Trade Organizations fail, Africa will pay the greatest price. That's what I said, because I believe that what we're going to have, what we're seeing, is plurilateral agreements. Plurilateral agreements when countries start forming blocks, and Africa will be left out. So that is why the African Continental Free Trade Area is so important, because then you can come to the table as a block and you can better trade with each other. I think that one thing, if I can digress, that we learned from the pandemic is that when Africa was isolated from the world, whether it was testing, PPEs, it sent a loud message. It was each country for itself and God for us all, and all these commitments were made. And one of the best things, God just intervened, and a lot of Africans didn't die. Afra-Exim Bank came in as the largest Africa contributor because it had already seen this, and it started mobilizing the equipment and the testing kits. But it just shows you that regions of the world will look out for their own interests. I do not criticize them. So for all of you on the call, I just want to repeat as a follow-up, determine if Africa will become a demographic dividend or demographic disaster and be a part of that. This whole thing about debt dependency, to me, it goes down. You know what? I will go into debt personally, if I were an African country, to add value to my primary raw materials. Now, I wouldn't do it at any cost, but I would go into debt because I know that if I'm just exporting it in a raw form, I'm only going to get 10% of the value. That's why I'm a huge fan of what Aliko Dangote is doing, the refinery. How can you continue to export crude oil? Then you have to buy it back from somebody else that you can't afford. The government has to subsidize it. It's a vicious cycle. I haven't even talked about aid because I have never been a big fan of aid. I think aid should be transitioned. I believe in humanitarian aid. The development assistance, I can say for 10 years, the U.S. has put about $81 billion at one point in aid to Africa. And I can tell you, I believe most of that money never hit the ground. I believe we developed an aid industrial complex around Washington. I still am pained when I see African leaders coming to Washington begging for aid, literally begging, because there is no country in the world that has developed on aid. When you go to aid, the region will never develop on aid. It would just never. Show me one region that did. You know, Afghanistan received over $2.2 trillion. And I think just US aid over 20 years, and it had no lasting development. In a decade, Africa has received $500 billion from all sources, and it still has 3% of participation in global value chains and trade. I mean, isn't that what the aid is supposed to do? Make you self-sustainable, creating jobs and enterprises, exports that's producing the kind of goods at the scale that African can sell to the world, looking at how you trade, how you produce, how you trade, you know, and doing it with productivity where you can reinvest some of the returns and skilling people up, applying this advanced technology. I mean, I look at the $800 billion, right? When we look at just like incredible $500 billion in aid over the decade. I mean, if you had a business, would your business survive spending $800 billion and you couldn't really measure the return? I tell my team all the time, if I can't measure it, if I can't see it, it doesn't exist for me. So aid has become a sedative when what Africa needs is a stimulus. And we need some aid. It has to be smart aid. But it's that kind of trade that builds nations, investment, not interventions that build results. But let me be clear, if there is a humanitarian crisis, the world should jump in. But a lot of this should be distinguished: aid, humanitarian crisis, and development aid. And development aid is where it really has fallen apart. Well, I think that the AfCFTA provides an excellent framework. The modalities are excellent. It's the execution. And in 4-4, how do we hold the leaders accountable? I talked to you in the lecture about some of these trade barriers, even among African countries that have signed the AfCFTA. They're still coming back to their own interests instead of the collective good. And so how do you change that? And I think the only way to change that is from the bottom up, from the people, from civil society, from the students, and you hold your leaders accountable, because sometimes there will be some short-term disruptions from trade for a longer-term gain. How do they balance out these kind of disruptions? Those are the questions and solutions you can come in and fill. But one of the greatest contributions you can make is to understand it, take control of the narrative, because the narrative around the AfCFTA is so complex that the common man or woman on the street or in the village, they don't see what it has to do with them. But you can do that. Make the message understandable, build the advocacy for it, and hold leaders accountable for not adhering to it.